Well, I'm delighted to be joined by musicians, conductors, composers, Bob Chilcott and John Rutter for this chat, which we're sending out to all of our friends connected with Phoenix Chorale across the valley and beyond. And I thought it'd be wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to two of the leading lights of choral music who are very much still alive, well and operating, even despite the current coronavirus difficulties. So hello, John Rutter, and hello, Bob Chilcott. Delighted to have you.
Hello, everyone.
I first wanted to start by just asking you why you think live choral music has always been and remains so important. And the reason for asking is there are several articles I've read in the last 6 months that seem to put forward the view that because we've carried on doing virtual choirs in lockdown, perhaps there's not the need to meet in person to sing. And I wondered what your view on that theory was.
So, who's going to go first?
I think you should, John.
Well, recordings are wonderful, but they're only a substitute for the real thing. And in a way, I don't need to tell any of the people who are members of the Phoenix Chorale what makes live music making special. It's being in the same space with other musicians, making the fantastic sounds that choirs can make. And recordings have improved beyond recognition in my lifetime, but they still don't really capture what a live choir sounds like. There's something visceral about it, something that hits you in the guts. And of course, the fact that you are together in one space says something about the ability of music to bring people together, which is terrifically important. And I know I've said this before, but when you bring people together, you potentially bring peoples together internationally. And so in a way, even if it's just your 20 people in your small church choir, or maybe your 200 people in your large civic chorale, you are saying something about how the human race is a family and families should be together. Now, I do think that virtual choirs are probably here to stay, and they will play a part in choral music making for the foreseeable future. And really the reason for that is that they enable people who for one reason or other can't join an in the flesh choir to take part. People who are housebound, perhaps who have physical disabilities, or caring for someone at home, or who live in a remote place. I know that some of the virtual choirs that we've had in the UK over these last few months have had delighted messages from people who live in the Outer Hebrides, which are remote Scottish islands, saying, for the first time in my life, I've been able to be in a choir and it feels wonderful. So I think that's a discovery that in a way the world has stumbled upon in the last few months. And I think it has a part to play, but I would firmly say that it is not the whole part.
Thanks, John. And Bob, you mentioned before we started that you were really enjoying doing some local teaching and that the face-to-face contact is very important for you. Is that a big part of how you feel about live choral music and choirs getting together?
Oh, definitely. I agree with absolutely everything John says, but I do think we can't overemphasize the community aspect of being together. That's so important in the whole process of singing. And I've always felt with choir, when you come to choir, when people come together, they kind of leave a lot at the door. They become part of that community. I don't think there are many things that happen now in our life where people look at people and they judge them on the way they look or what they do or the kind of assumption that people have about people's lives. When you come to choir, you kind of leave all that at the door, become an entity. I mean, that's the intention, obviously, of singing together, that we get that entity. And I think that's something not to be underestimated, really. I love that aspect of it. I also, personally, I've always thought music is basically a live thing. It's a temporal thing that comes and goes. I suspect all of us have had that experience where we take part in a concert where we're all incredibly moved and we loved it and we wonderful, and then you hear a recording and you think that wasn't the concert I was in, because it sounds and feels completely different to the experience that you've had. And I think the importance of, you know, you can go to a gallery and you can look at a picture and you can stand there for hours and look at it and think how wonderful it is, but music comes and goes, and it's something that remains deep inside the soul when we experience that. I think recordings are wonderful, but recordings, in a sense, they're only a reference. I think the actual live experience is the thing that is the most important thing in my mind.
There's a wonderful poem called Master of Music that you might both know, which speaks about that. It was set by Toby Hessian for the Kingsingers in 2018, and it speaks about this idea of music vanishing on the wind, unlike sculpture or visual art, which remains constant for a whole period of time. So I know exactly what you mean, Bob. And I know that the listeners would love to have just a quick history of how you both started to become involved with choral music. Would you both mind just a very quick bullet point of how you grew up in choral music and how you became enamored of it? Bob, do you want to go first?
Well, I was lucky to, I joined a parish church choir when I was very young. Like many people, post-war families, I was, you know, we had very modest family circumstances, but everyone went to church on a Sunday. And you joined the choir. A lot of people joined the choir because you could go to the circus at Christmas. You know, it was that kind of thing. It was a very good choir I sang in, and I had the chance to audition for the choir of King's Cambridge through the vicar of the church, who thought it was a good idea. My parents had no idea what that was. I then, of course, had that experience, and it was a fantastic experience. One, when I look back at it now, you think I learned all that without really knowing it at the time. It was that kind of instinctive way of learning, which I think in Britain we're very good at, actually, and our tradition has really nurtured that way of learning, and a lot of our musicians as a result are very instinctive. I then, because I enjoyed it so much, I tried my hardest to get back there as a student to King's, which I did, and I studied music, and I also sang in the choir as a choral scholar. And then I started my way working in music in all sorts of different areas, just simply because it was the only thing I could do, actually. And I loved it. And in a sense, it was, you know, something that I just fell into it because I was incapable pretty much of doing anything else except something very menial. I'm just going to make this quick point, if you don't mind, about our cathedral tradition, because I read recently there was an article in the newspaper in Britain about how the church in Britain should stop wasting money on cathedral choirs and on college choirs and all this sort of stuff. And there was a letter from in the paper from a composer, one composer who was a chorister at Winchester, along with 4 other choristers who all live in Los Angeles, and they all write music for movies and television shows. And the chap pointed out it was all because of that education he had. He's given millions of pounds of work to British musicians. I mean, it's been, you know, it's been a way of teaching that we've taken for granted. And I think that during this time, we suddenly think, gosh, we've got to keep that going.
Agreed. I think it's imperative. And, you know, in other walks of life as well, Alistair Cook, the former England cricket captain, often talks about his days as a chorister at St Paul's and the patience and the stamina that he had to build up as helping him as he became an international sports star. So I think there are so many areas where that tradition and that form of education benefits society hugely widely. So it would be terrible to see it go. Yeah. Thanks, Bob. So John, what was your story like?
Oh gosh, well, it didn't actually start in a church choir. Bob was rather lucky because was it not the case, Bob, that among your fellow choristers was none other than Sir Andrew Davis, as he now is, who is the music director of the Chicago Lyric Opera, and you were best mates with his brother. And right. So evidently your church choir was a seedbed of future excellence and fame. But I didn't actually join a church choir. I mean, I was baptized in St. Marylebone Parish Church, actually, but my parents didn't think to put me into the choir there. However, I did start to sing because in those days in England, there was compulsory religious observance at the start of each day. And that was built in to our national system of state education. And of course, it's very different from America, where there is a separation between church and state. There isn't any such separation in Britain. And the funny thing is that, of course, church going is much more widespread in America than it is in Britain, where it is actually the case that, of course, our Queen, who's the head of state, is also the head of the Church of England. And anyway, thus it was that we all got 15 minutes, and my generation, it was taken quite seriously. And so picture me at the age of 4, singing my little lungs out with all things bright and beautiful and other such ditties, the words of which, before the days of video screens, were written up in beautiful italic handwriting on a large scroll that was hung at the front of the school hall. That's when I first discovered I was going short-sighted, because it was beginning already to blur like an impressionist painting. But I remember my mum kept my first singing report, and it said, John sings well if he sings softly. And so I guess I was a bit over-enthusiastic. I was useless at sport, and that is where Bob and I differ, because Bob is a great devotee of various forms of sport. I find it's like being tone deaf. They all leave me completely cold. I was once taken to a football match at the age of 10, and I just wanted to go home and practice my scales on the piano. So I'm afraid that chromosome has always been missing in my makeup, but I appreciate the value of sport actually, because it does a lot of the same things that being in a choir does. It brings people together, and it gives you a sense of teamwork, group solidarity, and aspiring towards excellence. The difference for me is that in a choir, you are potentially singing a work of genius, and a football game, well, you're playing according to the rules, but you'll have to tell me, Bob, were they drawn up by a person of genius? I don't know. Anyway, from these humble beginnings in my school choir, I was then recruited as I rose up the junior school and was said to have a nice treble voice. Bob sang I Vow to Thee My Country as his audition piece at King's College, and that got you in. Gustav Holst, a fine melody to be sure, and Master Chilcott was then a member of King's College Choir from then on, under the legendary Sir David Wilcox. I sang the Mozart Alleluia. So sopranos among you will remember the top C optional at the end, but nothing daunted, I took the top C, despite which I sang this in the school singing competition and did not win. The winner, as I recall, was my great friend John Taverner, later Sir John Taverner, who sang Schubert's Ständchen, the beautiful serenade, and evidently that moved the ill-advised judge's heart to give him the prize. And the resentment might have lingered, except he was such a great friend. And had I known he was going to go on to the knighthood, I might have been nicer to him. But we used to show one another our early efforts at composition, and his were better than mine. But well, there you go. I attended a very musical school, Highgate School in North London. It's a boys' school, and it was a chapel, there's generally a chapel choir, and it wasn't so much a case of having to tempt me in. It would have been difficult to keep me out, really. And I grew up in singing under the wise guidance of a wonderful man called Edward Chapman, and you could possibly find something on him in Google. He was quite a composer, a pupil of a name well known to English church musicians, Charles Wood. And Charles Wood was responsible, and I think in Phoenix you've probably sung Ding Dong Merrily on High at Christmas time in the classic Charles Wood harmonization. And so Dr. Wood, whose wisdom I think I received at one remove, was actually my grandfather in music. And Bob's path and my path began to converge, though at different times, because we both had mentors who encouraged us to try for Cambridge as a place to study music. And I knew nothing about it, really. I mean, my ignorance was total. But I thought, well, okay, aren't there lots of colleges at Cambridge? And I knew I didn't want to try for King's because I thought I'd be overwhelmed by the grandeur of the chapel. Many of you will know what King's College Chapel looks like. I mean, it's a large and magnificent building, standing next door along the banks of the River Cam to its humbler neighbour, Clare College, which has a beautiful chapel, small, 18th century, seats maybe 150 people at a push. And I thought, that is more on a domestic scale that I can comprehend. And so I boldly applied to Clare College, Cambridge, and got in. And really that's where the story does come together with Bob's, because we both studied for a music degree. And Bob, I don't know what it was like by your time, but in my time, we were pretty much left to our own devices to just get on with it. Nobody told us what to compose or how to compose. And most of our time was our own. What was it like for you?
I would agree with you, John. It was absolutely the same. I was lucky enough to have some composition lessons while I was at King's with Alan Ridout. You'll remember him. He used to come up to
Canterbury.
Yes, he used to come up. He was a very good teacher, actually, and it was all incredibly vague, and we were left to get on in our own devices. I think I can remember going to my first year exams, really just thinking, got to do a first year exam, and you just really, the great thing about Cambridge, I think, I'm not sure whether it's the same now, but at that time, it attracted a lot of musicians and it attracted a lot of very fine instrumental players. I think, when I was at Cambridge, there were a huge number of players who've been in the National Youth Orchestra and that sort of thing, who are now really at the top of their game, professionals. But they had lots of opportunity just to play, and there was so much music going on that that was what involved everybody, and I found that was the case. John, you might be interested. Just the other day, in fact, I got out a recording, one of my very favourite recordings, actually, of music by Howells, recorded by St John's College choir with Christopher Robinson. And there's a certain Chris Gabbitas singing in the bass section on that one. It's a fantastic recording, that on the Naxos label. I remember that they recorded all that English music with St John's Choir, and the choir is magnificent in that recording. And that's one of my very, very favourite CDs, actually, particularly the recording of the Requiem on the House Requiem on that one.
Well, that box set conducted by Christopher Robinson will never be surpassed.
No.
And if you can still buy box sets, I'm not sure that you can. CDs are a sunset technology, but I'd recommend any member of the Phoenix Chorale who loves choral music to stump up. It won't be terribly much money because it's on the Naxos label, but it's a kind of panorama of English choral music, roughly between the years of, I suppose, Elgar and going up to Benjamin Britten and perhaps a little beyond. But Cambridge, and of course we're just singing the praises of our alma mater, which mustn't sound smug, because course, the only of excellence, but it was a rather remarkable one. And I think what was at the heart of it was the fact that Oxford and Cambridge are collegiate universities. It's more than a federation of colleges, but it's not a campus university. The thing is that the university was founded 800 and something years ago, and the students and those who taught them had to live somewhere. And so colleges were founded basically as dorms, halls of residence. And some of these were founded, like Clare College, by members of the nobility, Lady Elizabeth de Clare. Some were founded by kings and queens. And of course, King's has the grandest chapel. All of those thought of religion and learning as very much intertwined. And so you didn't have a college without a chapel, and you certainly didn't have one without a dining hall and a bar. Remember, the drinking age is a little younger in England, and I think in the Middle Ages you drank beer when you were as young as 10 or 11 or 12 because it was healthier than the water, which could well give you typhoid at the time. So I mean, that was the excuse anyway. And I think actually those chapels and their choirs have provided the kind of solid core of professionalism which has spread outwards. And as you rightly say, Bob, many who didn't want to sing in a choir but wanted to take instrumental playing seriously while at the same time gaining an academic degree have been attracted, and goodness me, we do export conductors, don't we? I mean, when I think back, there was Sir John Eliot Gardner, Richard Hickox, Sir Andrew Davis, who I mentioned, Sir Mark Elder, and this was rather remarkable. David Munro, who started the early music movement in Britain, really, and Christopher Hogwood, who built on that and continued. All of these, at one time or another, passed through the University of Cambridge. And so it was immensely fortunate to be there and be a musician. And what makes it rather different from the American university system is that if, for example, you were ambitious to conduct and you wanted to do a complete ring cycle, nobody would stop you, provided you could recruit the singers and the instrumentalists and all that. You could do your private enterprise Wagner or anything. And that was something that meant that I think it's true to say of Cambridge conductors that the techniques they use, the baton techniques, can be, let's say, idiosyncratic. When I think of somebody like Sir Roger Norrington, who stands there, and you wouldn't describe it as a beat, but he encourages with body language. And of course, with the excellent players that he usually works with, I mean, that's probably all they really need. But I suppose what Cambridge conductors all have is a passion to conduct and a passion for the music. And for asking the question that I always ask first, if the composer was alive today and standing just over my shoulder, would he or she say, yes, that's exactly what I meant?
Yeah,
of course, we can't read the mind of the dead, but we can only go on the evidence. I always remember the great privilege of having Herbert Howells, who's a composer known to church musicians and perhaps not widely elsewhere, but by the time I was the very young director of music at Clare College, we commissioned him, and he was in his 80s by that point, to write an anthem in celebration of our college's 650th birthday. And it was a great moment in my life that I shall never forget, when he arrived in the middle of our rehearsal in the chapel. He walked into Clare College Chapel, this silver-haired gentleman, no more than 5 feet tall, and we were just starting to work on his piece. And he stood there beaming, and he didn't like the rather Baroque organ we had in our chapel. I mean, he peered up at it and said to the young organ scholar, "My dear," I said, "have you got anything a little less aggressive?" And so we didn't quite have the instrument he was looking for, but he liked the choir. And I thought, my goodness me, I can ask him what he meant. And I remember that some of his metronome marking seemed, I think, a little on the slow side for the fairly small building we were in. Herbert, was that okay? He said, it's beautiful, my dear. And I said, well, Herbert, you know, we didn't quite observe all your metronome markings. And my dear, he said, my metronome markings are always wrong. That was not the case with Benjamin Britten, who was very insistent. But, you know, Cambridge made it possible for me to meet a living legend like Herbert Howells. And so that was just one of the many things that I gained from it. And it turned us all loose into the world. Chris and Bob and me, and none of us have starved since. So it must have done something good for us.
Well, I mean, thank you both. It's amazing stories. And those Naxos recordings, I was on only a few of them actually. I wanted to be on the Finzi one, and it happened after I left. But the House one I remember very, very fondly. And thanks for your kind words. The House Requiem is a piece that the Phoenix Chorale performed relatively recently, and the members that I've spoken to love that piece. It's just the most, really that English genre of Howells and Finzi, Rutter, and various other composers from around that area. They foresaw the current movement of tonality and much choral composition, in my view. You think about Eric Whittaker and Morton Lauridsen and Dan Forrest and many other wonderful American composers. They seem to have taken on that mantle of tonalism and homophonic writing, which to my mind was sort of foreshadowed in Vaughan Williams and Howells and Finzi. Well, we've spoken a lot about the English choral tradition, and something which I think is quite different really is that the American choirs don't simply take what we have in England and regurgitate it. They very much have their own style and their own sound. And you've both worked extensively in America. What would you say are the marker posts of the American choral tradition? Bob, what would you say about that?
I'm a great admirer of the way that choir world is kind of organized in America. I think the tradition within states of things like all-state choirs, honor choirs, which we've tried to do in Britain actually, with very little success.
I'm afraid that's true.
Yeah.
I remember, Bob, there was we had visitors from Hungary, where there's a very strong choral tradition, who were eager to see how school choirs functioned in England, and they said they wanted to send a deputation to listen to the Cambridgeshire Youth Choir. Well, there wasn't one. And so a group of music teachers in our county got together and said, look, can we have a Cambridgeshire Youth Choir for just one day? And so, look, anyone in your school who can sing a bit, can you send them along to the music school in West Road in Cambridge? And absolutely, your lips must be sealed. You know, this is the Cambridgeshire Youth Choir, and that's all that anybody will find out about it in Hungary. And they're going to go home believing that this is what we do every day of every week. Sadly, not the case. Go on, Bob.
It's true, John. I remember with the Association of British Choral Directors, we tried to get one going. I did one with the children's choir, which we kept going for 8 years, through the devotion of a lady who you will know very well, Mavis Fletcher. She really worked hard but had to go and fight to get people to remain in the choir. But you know, I think that tradition has been very successful, and it's got a lot to do with the fact, I think, too, that in the United States, in many states, I think music in schools is variable, like it is very much in Britain, in the maintained sector, in the state sector. But in my experience, I've had a lot of fantastic experiences in the United States with young people who sing every day in school. There seems to be still a very strong movement to keep that going, which I hope maintains, because that keeps the motor of all these choirs going. And when you think in the state of Texas how they managed to get so many people auditioning for their all-state choir, and these all-state camps that they have, and working at music tirelessly for a long time. the word, there is a great honor in being in that. And I think that gives great, it gives a lot of credence to the idea of choir as an important thing. And of course, in the United States too, there is a very strong tradition in many states to a very good church singing, very large choirs, a real commitment to choral music. So I do admire that, and I admire the way that for such a big country in America, people manage to stay in contact and focus things together on state level and on national level in many different areas of music, both children's choirs and adult choirs. And I've also enjoyed hearing, I think in America, there is definitely an idea of a sound, much more of I've always found that the sound of American choirs, surprisingly, tends to be rather dark, where we in Britain, actually, when you look at it, we sing pretty bright, really. And I think a lot of our professional choirs, of course, have, who a lot of people will have heard, they have tenors and basses. A lot of them have had a very student life involved in choir singing, but we have an alto sections where they mix men and women together. So you have men and women altos, and that makes a difference to the way that the sopranos sound. And I often think when I hear the British choirs, we do sing very bright compared to the bright vowels compared to the American sound, which and I think, for me, the sound of most choirs in America tends to be fairly. There seems to be a kind of sense that a lot of people are aiming for a similar type of sound. I find that quite interesting. There are certain areas, funnily enough, of the United States where the sound does differ slightly. I think in Minnesota, it might be something to do with the Scandinavian heritage. They do tend to sing a little brighter, but I'm sure John has had much more experience than I have in this regard. But I'm a great admirer of the energy and the organization of choir. So in America, and it gives it it continues with good energy, and that's got to be great.
I think one thing that they've introduced in America, which we don't have quite so much in England and Europe, is the competitive element of singing. And whether you are an advocate for choral competitions, in some ways doesn't really matter. I think the great thing that has done in America is it's drawn particularly young people to choirs because it gives them a sense of belonging and school spirit. Perhaps if they're like John, a self-confessed person who's not a massive sports fan, let's put it that way, and they wouldn't get into the school football team or the school track and field squad or whatever it might be, the fact that they're in choir or indeed band allows them the chance to don a uniform, go out there and take pride in their school. And I think that really, really draws people to the competitive side of singing. Honour choirs in their own way are very competitive and very, very highly auditioned. And to me, the competitive side goes hand in hand with the pedagogical approach. I find that what both of you were speaking about in your English history, and it's the same as me, the musical knowledge and the musicianship was very much acquired, almost by osmosis. Whereas a child, you learn through listening and repetition and through these wonderful choir masters, whether in churches or chapels or cathedrals, who passed down this very organic way of making music. Speaking of Howes, my first choir master, Barry Ferguson, at Rochester Cathedral, was a student at Peterhouse and was taught composition by Herbert Howes. And Barry taught me composition as a child. So I'm a grandchild of Howes in terms of compositional family. And the way that Barry conducted and the way that many of the choral conductors in England seem to gesture, it's not based on a pedagogical pattern-based approach. It's based on acquired musicianship, which is then translated, as Roger Norrington does, in a very generalistic way, but we seem to understand what it means. And in America, I find it's the wonderful, incredible discipline they have in rehearsal and the formality and the structure of competition. and then also the acquired education comes down a link in a very pedagogical way, and that affects the sound as well. It makes the sound very clean, very very beveled, but you lose some of the immediacy and some of the spontaneity, perhaps. So it's very correct, but you lose a bit of spontaneity. The English choirs, on the other hand, are perhaps more spontaneous, but they're not always quite as polished because they're having to go through the repertoire so much faster. Do you have any thoughts on that, John?
Oh gosh, yes, many. I always think if you want to understand a country, look at its history and look at its roots. And England and Europe generally, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, was a society where the more useless your education was, the more it was valued. And the quadrivium, the four subjects that you learn, theology, astronomy, mathematics, and I can't remember what the other one was, didn't really have much practical application. And those who learned how to play an instrument or sang were rather looked down upon. And of course, that has lingered in that subjects like classics are still taught in British universities. And you could very well argue that, well, I actually think they are quite a lot of use to you. I mean, I'm always glad I studied Latin, but they don't have any very, very obvious practical application. And what has happened is that I suppose theoretical education has become more practical in the last 100 years or so. We do study things like engineering and chemistry at our universities. We never used to. Now, on the other hand, America's history was one of a vast country that had to be tamed pretty quickly. And so you needed an army of people with practical skills in engineering, in medicine, in agriculture. And those were what was taught. And particularly if you were a nation of immigrants, many of whom did not have English as their first language, you needed a clear pedagogical method to actually teach them and make sure that they acquired the skills they needed to make the country function. And I think, in a sense, looking to the more theoretical kind of education that was the norm in Europe as something that has come later, that in a way practice came before theory in America, whereas in Europe, theory came before practice. And that's why I think that the methodical approach to learning music that you've both alluded to in America came about because of the nation's history. Now, as to the sort of choral sounds that you've mentioned, I often think that the ideal of an English choir is rather like an inverted pyramid, that it is built down from the top and goes down to a rather narrow base. And if you look at some of our cathedral choirs, they were in a way absurdly out of balance in that Salisbury Cathedral choir, I'm not sure what the strength is now, but it used to have 16, 18, 20 choristers, young boy sopranos, and then just 2 altos, 2 tenors and 2 basses. That has now been modified, but fundamentally the key line was looked upon as the top line. Now, I think of American choral sound as being a pyramid the right way up, which is built up from the base. So you start with a good, solid, strong bass, and in a way, the upper voices become like harmonics that are built upon that bass. And as a matter of fact, when I rehearse with a choir, I very often start by working on the basses, because if the bass line is not in tune, nothing else can be in tune, because the harmonics are all sour. And when you finally get it right, and when the bass line is perfectly in tune, you get that beautiful rainbow effect that is impossible to capture on disc. But we all know what it sounds like. It's just, it clicks, it works, it's wonderful. And I think that is at the heart of it. And again, looking at American history, I was told the story by a very old gentleman who worked for the New York firm of Carl Fisher. And this was many years ago. And he said he was told by his grandfather that the founding being fish. As the immigrants came off the boat and were processed in Ellis Island. And in German, he would say, Musiker, Musiker, sind Sie vielleicht Musiker, Musik? And then when he found a musician who had come probably from his native land, then he would say, you come and work for me. And I think that's a lot of the story of how America learned music, really, that the sound, the tradition was largely Central European and German in the 19th and into the 20th century. And that, of course, is still evidenced today by the fact that in Britain, much to the amusement of American choirs, we still talk about hemi-demi semiquavers and all that, whereas America has adopted the German method of talking about whole notes, half notes, and quarter notes, exactly as, you know, Viertel, Achtel, and so on. So I think German music making cast a very long shadow over American music making. And that's one of the reasons that I think a rather darker sound was encouraged, because if you listen to early German recordings from 100 years ago, German singers do tend to go for rather dark covered vowels, which is quite different from the bright bel canto vowels that you would get in Italy. I think that tradition lingers on. Let's also remember about the general thrivingness of American choral music, that when you come from a homeland that you can never return to, and remember that immigration in those days was a one-way ticket. Once you got on the boat and sailed to America, there wasn't really any turning back, because you'd just be returning to the poverty or persecution that you faced in your homeland. And so what can you bring with you? Well, most of the immigrants didn't bring any money. They came with nothing except their skills and their memories. One of the things that you can bring with you is your music. And you can bring your faith, because America is a land where many faiths actually come from somewhere quite else. I always think it's rather sweet that the Moravians in America still play trombones just as they did in their native Moravia. And Lutherans still sing in parts of Minnesota. I've been present, seeing this for myself. They still sing a Bach chorale as a family grace around the table. And I think John, that bears witness. So, Chris.
Sorry, John, that leads me neatly into the next thing I wanted to ask about, which was, or to talk about, in the broadcast that we're putting out this month, October, with the Phoenix Chorale, it's the broadcast of my candidacy project when I was conducting them as one of the 4 Artistic Director finalists. And the choir performed one piece by each of you. And the piece which was originally arranged by you, John, was Barbara Allen, which is known as being one of the first folk songs which was sung in both the British Isles and in the new America. So it's a song which literally would have come across on the boat with the immigrants, as that you just spoke about, and sung from oral tradition. And you arranged this for the King Singers for a wonderful album about 30 years ago. But do you remember working on that song? What did the song say to you? And are you aware of the sort of American Atlantic Bridge roots of it, if you like?
Well, actually, no. I thought of it as, I think it's a Scottish folk song. And I was a member of probably the last generation that grew up singing folk songs in schools. There was a book with red covers that I remember to this day, and I have a copy on my shelves, the National Songbook. And Barbara Allen was most certainly in it. And I've always been drawn to Celtic folk song, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, because there's a certain lyrical flow, a certain melodic authenticity that I find very moving. You can hear it in the songs of the Beatles. Let's remember that Lennon and McCartney were Liverpool Irish, you know, and so actually the music that was in their blood and in their bones was from Ireland. And so interesting, you know, there are Ireland and Wales, there are hardly any English folk lullabies. Maybe we just put our kids to bed and slam the door on them in England, and don't have that lovely tradition of singing your child to sleep. I'd recommend any new parents, by the way, in the Phoenix Chorale, do sing to your little one last thing at night. Even when they're a tiny baby, it makes a difference.
What can you
That's advice given to me by Sir David Wilcox, which I failed to take.
What can you...
My own children, I'm sorry.
The arrangement that you wrote of that song, John, was very much loved by the chorale, and you graciously allowed me to rearrange it slightly, because in your arrangement it was for string quartet and for the six voices of the King's Singers. Can you recall the arrangement and how you felt when writing it, or the process?
Well, I do remember it came during a period I was really quite ill. I mean, I don't think that affected the music, but during the 1980s, I was afflicted with an ailment I don't recommend to anyone, called myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, otherwise known as post-viral fatigue syndrome. My immune system was shot to pieces, and probably still is to this day, but I've weathered the storm. And all I could do was short pieces. I said yes to the King's Singers because I didn't want to let them down, but I think I more or less dragged myself to my desk and forced myself to write, and got it off, as was often the case in those days, just in the nick of time for whatever recording it was they were making. And so, no, I don't remember any more than that, because to be honest with you, the 1980s was a decade I prefer to forget in my personal life.
Fair enough. And Bob, I think, Bob, you were on that recording, weren't you, with Barbara Allen?
I wasn't actually, but I remember that. I remember that very, very well. It was on the album called "Watching the White Wheat," and it was recorded, I suppose, in about 1983, 84, something like that. And when I started singing with the King's Singers, because I subbed for Bill Ives, who was not well, I remember one summer, it was summer 1985, I listened to that recording endlessly, because it was a beautiful recording, and I think it was, in the history of the King's Singers, it was one of those, it was the first CD that they'd made for EMI for quite a long time. Because they'd had a very successful period with EMI, but there was, I suppose it was the first one since the Madrigal one they made. And I loved that arrangement, John. I remember with the string quartet, and it was a very, very beautiful piece. And I remember the cassette in my car.
Well, it was a little later than that I did a whole album of folk song arrangements, similarly with a small instrumental group. And it was really a valentine to my own singing experience at school, where I grew up with those folk songs. I'm sure I would have sung Barbara Allen along with many others when I was no more than 8 or 9 years old. And fairly much forgotten repertoire now, sadly. But I thought it would just be nice to put together an album with my own choir, the Cambridge Singers, and an instrumental ensemble drawn from my friends in the City of London Sinfonia. And that has gone on over the years. I think it's now known as, oh goodness me, it's not Watching the White Wheat, because the King's Singers used that. Anyway, it is there as a little tribute to a part of my musical life. I think, in a way, so much music does spring from folk song.
I agree, absolutely.
Back to its roots.
Yeah, and there is that nationalistic side of folk song. I think of Bartók and Kodály in Hungary in particular, and then the Baltic, the singing revolution and the folk music that sprang from that to assist with the creation of a new nation. But Bob, you were on Annie Laurie, weren't you? And,
I was.
Which was the next folk song album the King's Singers released. And I believe, wasn't Mary's Wedding on that album?
It was.
Yeah.
It was. And we did that album with a flute player, American flute player, who's actually an early music player called Nancy Haddon, and the guitarist who lived in Baltimore, originally from Cuba, Manuel Barrueco. Fantastic Yeah, that they were on that recording, and yes, so that was on there. I do remember Mary's Wedding.
I contributed a couple of arrangements to that album. There was the Skyboat song, as I recall.
Absolutely right.
Well, this is all
in the same concert, Bob. We performed Mary's Wedding. So we performed John's Barbara Allen and your Mary's Wedding. And one of the tenors in the chorale is a fantastic guitar player. So he played the guitar part and we sang. And it was a wonderful, rousing finale to the concert. And when I was studying to join the King's Singers, I was learning all the music, as you do. And I had all those tapes, those wonderful tapes that Manfred Lux used to send over from Germany with all the pieces that I had to learn. And I can remember Barbara Allen and I can remember Mary's Wedding. And in starting a new chapter of my musical life, I wanted to pay homage to that. So I took Barbara Allen, I took Mary's Wedding, and the chorale loved singing them. We had a wonderful tenor soloist, a chap called J.J. Rafferty, who sang the opening line in Barbara Allen, which was my line in the King's Singers, and brought tears to my eyes in doing it. And then we had the whole choir stomping and clapping and playing guitar for Mary's Wedding. And do you remember, another good Celtic folk song, do you remember the process of writing that, Bob, and how that came about?
Yes, I do. I wanted to, I was a big fan at the time of, well, I still am actually, of the Chieftains. I love the Chieftains, the Irish group, who had a massive career in the United States. I can remember one time when because they used to record for BMG Records at the same time King's Singers did, and we went to some pop buyers thing in Beverly Hills, and we stayed in some very fancy hotel, and we went and sang. We sang something, but the Chieftains came to as well, and we ended up, of course, sitting on the same table as them at dinner that night in the West Hollywood restaurant. And I remember there were two guys, and I've forgotten their name now, but they said, it's so nice to have someone else to talk to, because I've sat with him after every concert for the last 16 years, and we just sit there and we don't say anything to each other. They were great. But that was the influence. It was the influence of the Chieftains, really, that made me approach that arrangement in that way. And I loved the song. I got the song from an album that the Chieftains did with the singer Van Morrison, and that's what made me choose that song.
Now, I shouldn't be telling other people's stories for them, but I've got a Bob story here, because many people in the choral world were quite bowled over by an arrangement Bob did of a then very little known song called And So It Goes. Maybe you have sung it in the Phoenix Chorale. Virtual choirs have certainly been doing it in the last few months, and it does lend itself to being done that way. And it was written by someone I admit was not as well known to me as he should have been, Billy Joel. And I thought, my goodness me, this song is an absolute gem, brings tears to the eyes, all of that. And so I actually paid money and bought the physical CD that it came from, Billy Joel's album. And okay, so I put it on, and I thought, he's got a terrible voice. And he played the piano, and I thought, oh my goodness me, he's an absolutely appalling pianist, you know, really bad. And I didn't like any of the songs, but I persevered all the way to the end, and we finally got to And So It Goes. And I thought, oh, you know, Bob must have slogged his way through the whole album. Maybe he liked it better than I did, but he found truly the diamond in the dung heap, as far as I'm concerned, and turned it into mixing the metaphor purest gold. And I would think Mr. Joel has good reason to be grateful to Professor Chilcott for the dimension that he brought to the song. Do listen to the, well, don't listen to the album, Phoenix Chorale members. And if you're Billy Joel fans, then please forgive my heresy. But I've got a little bit of a blank spot for him. But I do like And So It Goes, as arranged by Chilcott.
It's a great song. I fondly love it.
I do remember the album was called, yeah, the album was called Stormfront. In fact, yeah, because you sang the solo on it, Chris, in I should think rather lots of times, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, it was quite a few times. And actually, John, I completely forgive you, but my wife and I really are quite big fans of Billy Joel, and we go and watch him whenever we can. But don't worry, it's fine. It's no problem. He's written some other wonderful ballads. Lullaby, Goodnight, My Angel, arranged very nicely by Philip Lawson. And
Yeah,
that has been sung by the Phoenix Chorale, but I'm intending that the chorale sings And So It Goes in Bob's wonderful arrangement at some point in the future. Now, of course, Christmas is a season that is linked with music and linked with you two composers very much as well. And I wondered whether we might just be able to have a quick word about Christmas and what Christmas means to you in terms of choral music and why you think it's so linked. Bob, your wonderful Shepherd's Carol, Bob, is a piece that I love at Christmas, which I know was composed for King's College, Cambridge. But Christmas through the years, has that always been a real song fest for you in your life?
Oh, definitely. And I'm going to embarrass John now, because when I was at school, I went to hear the Bach Choir. The Bach Choir used to do a concert in the Royal Albert Hall every year with the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. And when I was at school, if you sang in choir, you know, we were all so excited to sing the Shepherd's Pipe Carol. And I remember going to the festival hall, to the Royal Albert Hall to see the Bach Choir with my family, packed. David Wilcox conducting, and they did the Shepherd's Pipe Carol. And of course, John, you came up on stage, long hair, nice little glasses, probably in a velvet suit with a big kipper tie. And we thought, look at him, he was the rock star. So John, you've kind of, you've defined Christmas for so many people for a long, long time. And I think what is so important about Christmas is that people recognize, musically, people recognize the kind of need to sing melody and to sing communally. And I think it's the focus for many people for their choirs for the whole year. I love writing Christmas music, and I love finding there's so many beautiful texts written. I mean, I know, John, you've written a lot of texts yourself, but
desperation.
I mean, we have in Europe there's a big tradition of Marian songs, and then later songs from the early 20th century texts from the late 19th century, but of course a lot of the hymn texts as well that we share in North America and in Europe. You know, they're things that everybody knows. So yes, Christmas is a very important thing, and I love it actually, and I love it from a musical point of view very much.
Thank you, John. I know you're a big Mr. Choral Christmas, really, aren't you?
Well, I sang in my school chapel choir, as I have said, and Christmas was a high point of our singing year. We used to present every December a festival of 9 lessons and carols, which I didn't realise until slightly later was shamelessly modelled on the King's College Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols. We weren't quite as good, but the outlines were very much the same. And so it seemed only a short step from singing all these lovely Christmas carols to trying my hand at writing 1 or 2 of my own. And I think my very earliest one, of which there's any surviving evidence, was called the Nativity Carol. I was about 16, I think, when I wrote that. And I put it in for a competition for the same Bach Choir carol concert that Bob has mentioned. Sir David Wilcox was the adjudicator. And so I turned in the Nativity Carol. and it didn't win. Now, the idea was it was supposed to be something that an audience or congregation should join in. So the fact that it has a descant that goes up to a top A probably didn't help. But it wasn't a winner, I'm afraid. Didn't even get a highly commended, but it did get published. And so it was, I think, my very first published composition, only just a little 4-minute carol. Now, you've got to fast forward about 8 years to when Sir David Wilcox was kind enough to ask me to be the co-editor for the 2nd volume of Carols for Choirs, the Orange book, which you may have come across. And every Friday evening after the university chorus rehearsal, we would adjourn to his house in sitting and do a pile of possible inclusions in the book, mostly sent to us by our publishers. And we got, somewhat to my embarrassment, to the Nativity Carol. Now, of course, it had actually done rather well commercially, so Oxford University Press put it there in the pile, and David Wilcox opened it, and oh yes, he said, well, we must have the Nativity Carol in the book. And I said, just a minute, David, I said, I turned that in for a competition. You were the judge, and it didn't win. So you can't have thought much of it. And he looked at it again and smiled and said, I think it's improved remarkably since then, John. So it did go into the book. And I suppose all I would say about writing Christmas carols is that once I started, it somehow seemed difficult to stop. And so over the years, I have done quite a few of them, encouraged somewhat by the fact that music critics generally go on holiday in the month of December. And it's not probably a sin to write a tune. I am drawn to melody. I must admit, what happened, I mean, in the 19th century was that by the end of the century, Johann Strauss couldn't have written Tristan and Isolde, and Wagner couldn't have written the Blue Danube. Composers began to specialize in one sort of music or another. At the beginning of the century, you get Franz Schubert writing dance music for a dance hall, just like today's hip hop or rock, right? And the next day writing a string quintet that would be sublime. You didn't have to specialize, but by the time you got to the 20th century, concert and operatic music went in one direction, developing all kinds of incredible, wonderful things that I love. I mean, texture and new sound worlds and all of that, while melody kind of crept out of the room and took refuge in the world of operetta and then musical theatre. And that's one of the interesting things, that I'm born and raised a Brit, and I still live here in Britain, but an awful lot of the influence on my music, I think, was American, by which I mean the classic Broadway songwriters who I worship, from Jerome Kern through Richard Rodgers, Irving Berlin, Cole Porter, Stephen Sondheim. You know, they were people who understood the interaction of words and music so brilliantly. They knew that a melody was a way of carrying the sense of a text right into the heart of the listener. And that's something that possibly has not seemed so important in the world of contemporary classical. And so insofar as I love melody, I love a chance to write it. And in conjunction with words, of course, it becomes something quite other, more than the sum of the parts. And it's one of the reasons that I like small lyric forms. I haven't written as many large-scale pieces as I would like, mainly because I divide my energies between composing and conducting. But there's a lot of American influence, and I've always loved the open-hearted feeling of American music, by which I would single out, I suppose, Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein. Those guys wrote music that opens its heart to you, and I'd include moving music in that. I mean, think of, you know, Elmer Bernstein and the Magnificent Seven and all of that. It's music which gets you right there, and that is something I think to be cherished. And so it was a big day in my life, actually, when I first visited America. The year was well, never mind when, a long time ago. And of course, I've been coming back and forth ever since. Very honoured to be able to do so, to work with all kinds of choirs and orchestras. And it's a part of my musical life that I salute. And I'm only sad that at this moment I can't be with you. I was supposed to be conducting on Memorial Day next year in Carnegie Hall, but I fear they're just about to announce the cancellation of their spring season for next year. So we'll have to wait.
It's wonderful to hear you speak so warmly about all of our American friends and musicians, and I certainly have loved building a new musical life there, and both teaching my students in Redlands, which I believe is where you met your lovely wife Joanne, John, and also conducting the choir in Phoenix. And the wonderful thing about the Phoenix Chorale is it's an ensemble very much for and of its community. It's not a choir where the members are flown in. It's not a choir of session musicians. It's a choir of people with a lot of passion for their art, a huge amount of heart, which you've just spoken to, John. And I think the motivation and the energy and the love that goes into choral singing in America is truly extraordinary. And they're certainly huge fans of both of you. And I've taken up enough of your time, and I'm very, very grateful to you both. But just before we stop, could you each tell me what you would say one of your favorite or most memorable pieces of choral music is, and why? Just to close, Bob, why don't you tell us what, it's impossible to pick, but what today would you say is one of your top pieces of choral music, and why does it move you in the way it does?
I think it's loads of pieces came into my mind, but one piece which I always go back to, it's a little song by Thomas Campion called Never Weather Beaten Sail. And I always listen to the group Stile Antico singing it. If I want to be cheered up, I listen to that, because it's actually, well, the way they sing it is beautiful. It's a very simple piece, but like all simple things, very, very difficult to do well. And I love to listen to that. I love the simplicity of the text and the feeling it gives me, and also of the shape of the piece. That's my current one for this next 10 minutes.
And what would be the first piece on your Christmas choral playlist this year?
My Christmas, it's What Sweeter Music by John Rutter.
Very good. No money has changed hands.
No brainer.
Well, I will name in that case The Shepherd's Carol by Bob Chilcott, which, if ever there was one, is a piece of music written with a text for a choir and for a certain acoustic. I've heard that performed in many, many places. It's never quite the same as when you hear it in King's College Chapel, the building for which it was written.
Thank you, John. And for you, non-Christmas, what's your top non-Christmas choral piece at the moment?
Anything and everything. It would be much quicker to just name the music that I don't like. And when there's something that goes past me, I always blame myself. I've never been able to relate to the music of Carl Nielsen, for example, and I don't know why not. I hear people going on about how wonderful he is, and similarly, I'm sorry to say I don't like Prokofiev. Not that he did terribly well with those cantatas, of course, and I can see all that's good and wonderful about it, but it sort of leaves me cold. But almost anything else, depending on the mood I'm in, will find me a ready listener, and particularly if it's something I might be able to steal from later.
Wonderful. Well, John Rutter, Bob Chilcott, thank you so much. It's a joy to see you. It's so hard to feel community in these times, and it's such a pleasure to see both of you and to hear more about you and to receive your wisdom. I know that all of the people watching and listening in Phoenix and Arizona and the US and beyond will be so grateful for your time. I'm very grateful. Please take care. I hope your families remain safe and well, and I hope that we're able to meet again in person very, very soon. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.
It's been my pleasure.